Uh, don't embarrass us today, Julia. God knows your groom is doing enough of that just by showing up. Frederick Harrington whispered, his grip bruising his daughter's arm. He thought she was throwing her life away on a penniless bookkeeper. He thought her cheap DIY wedding would be the laughingstock of their high society family. What he didn't know, what no one in her cruel, status-obsessed family knew, was that the world's cameras were waiting just outside those heavy oak doors. Julia wasn't just getting married, she was ascending. To understand the absolute poetic justice of Julia's wedding day, one first has to understand the suffocating gilded cage of the Harrington family. They lived in Greenwich, Connecticut, in a sprawling, sterile mansion that looked less like a home and more like a museum dedicated to her father's ego. Frederick Harrington, Julia's father, was a man who worshipped at the altar of net worth. He had made a fortune in commercial real estate during the late 90s, clawing his way up from a middle-class background in Ohio to the upper echelons of East Coast society. But the problem with new money is that it is desperately loudly insecure. Frederick didn't just want to be rich. He wanted to be old money. He wanted pedigree. He wanted the kind of generational respect that cannot be bought, but he spent millions trying to buy it anyway. Her mother Diane was his perfect accomplice. A former pageant queen with a spine of steel and a heart to match, she viewed her children not as human beings, but as luxury assets to be managed and traded. And then there was Julia's older sister Victoria. Victoria was the golden child. Tall blonde, ruthlessly ambitious, and entirely devoid of empathy, she was exactly the daughter their parents wanted. She played tennis at the country club, dated the sons of hedge fund managers, and eventually married Brett Hastings, a tech bro with a loud mouth and a bank account that made Frederick weep with joy. Their wedding was a $2 million spectacle featured in town and country. Julia, on the other hand, was the disappointment. She was the quiet brunette middle child who preferred the smell of old library books to the chlorine of the country club pool. She didn't care about designer labels, social climbing, or marrying into the right zip code. She loved history. She loved art. Julia spent her teenage years hiding in the attic, reading Victorian literature and teaching herself Latin while her mother constantly reminded her to fix her posture and stop eating carbs. "You're a Harrington, Julia." Her father would bark across the massive mahogany dining table, swirling his expensive scotch. "Act like one. Stop wearing those thrift store sweaters. You look like a charity case. How do you expect to land a man of substance when you walk around looking like a librarian?" "Maybe I want to be a librarian," she mumbled once when she was 17. The silence that followed was deafening. Her father slammed his glass down. "No daughter of mine is going to work for a public servant's wage. You will go to business school, you will join the firm, and you will marry someone who adds value to this family." Julia didn't do any of those things. The day after she graduated from a quiet liberal arts college, much to her father's disgust as she had rejected his alma mater UPenn, she packed 2 suitcases and boarded a one-way flight to London. Julia had secured a junior position in the antiquities department at the Victoria and Albert Museum. The salary was barely enough to cover the rent for a tiny damp flat in Kensington, which she shared with 3 other girls. But for the first time in her 22 years of life, she was free. For 4 years, Julia thrived in obscurity. She learned how to restore 18th century manuscripts. She drank cheap tea in the museum break room. She wandered through the rain-slicked streets of Mayfair and Soho, entirely unbothered by the Harrington family's obsessive need for perfection. Her family rarely called. To them, she was a lost cause, an embarrassment they only vaguely acknowledged at country club dinners when someone asked how she was doing. "Oh, Julia is going through a bohemian phase in Europe." Her mother would sigh, rolling her eyes. Julia was happy being the forgotten Harrington. She had her books, her art, and her quiet life. She didn't need a man of substance. She just needed peace. But fate, as it turns out, has a very wicked sense of humor. It happened on a gloomy Tuesday in November. Julia had been sent by the museum to a highly exclusive appointment-only rare bookstore tucked away in a quiet alley off Pall Mall. The shop, Hathaway and Sons, smelled of leather bindings and dust. She was there to authenticate a disputed collection of medieval poetry. She was hunched over a heavy wooden table, magnifying glass in hand, completely absorbed in the intricate gold leaf of a 14th century illuminated manuscript when she heard a throat clear behind her. I believe you'll find the pigment on the third folio is a Victorian reproduction, not an original lapis lazuli. Julia spun around, annoyed by the interruption. Standing there was a man who looked like he had stepped out of a 1950s British novel. He was tall, with unruly dark blonde hair that desperately needed a trim, and kind, intelligent hazel eyes. He was wearing a faded, slightly frayed olive green Barber jacket over a thick plain wool sweater. There was an effortless, quiet grace about him, completely devoid of the aggressive, chest-puffing arrogance she was so used to seeing in the men her family associated with. "Excuse me." Julia bristled, setting down her magnifying glass. "I happen to be an expert from the V&A. I think I know how to spot a Victorian forgery." He offered a devastatingly charming, lopsided smile. "I don't doubt your expertise, miss, but I know it's a reproduction because my great-great-grandfather spilled a glass of port on the original in 1882 and had it secretly restored so his mother wouldn't find out." Julia stared at him, taken aback. "Your great-great-grandfather? Who are you?" "Arthur," he said simply, extending a hand. "I own a few pieces in this collection. The shop owner let me back here. I hope I haven't startled you." His handshake was warm, firm, and calloused the hands of someone who worked outdoors, not someone who sat in a boardroom. She introduced herself, her initial annoyance melting away under his warm, grounded presence. They spent the next 2 hours huddled over the manuscript, arguing playfully about historical restoration techniques. He was brilliantly educated, witty, and profoundly humble. When her work was done, he asked if she would join him for coffee. That coffee turned into a 4-hour dinner at a tiny, dimly lit pub in Chelsea. Over the next few months, Arthur and Julia became inseparable. Their courtship was quiet and unpretentious. He didn't take her to Michelin-starred restaurants or try to impress her with flashy cars. He drove a battered 10-year-old Land Rover Defender that smelled faintly of wet dog and pine needles. They took long weekend drives out to the countryside, ate fish and chips on the hood of his car in the rain, and spent hours wandering through free art galleries. When she asked him what he did for a living, he was vaguely dismissive but honest. "My family is in agriculture and estate management," he explained, stirring his tea. "We have a rather large plot of land up north, and it requires a lot of upkeep. Tenant farms, historical preservation, that sort of thing. It's a lot of paperwork, honestly." "So you're a farmer?" she teased. "Something like that." He laughed, his eyes crinkling. "A glorified groundskeeper." It was perfect. Arthur was everything her family despised. He had no corporate ambition, no desire to be on a Forbes list, and seemed perfectly content living a quiet, modest life. He didn't care about designer clothes. His wardrobe consisted mostly of well-worn tweeds, scuffed leather boots, and plain white shirts. Julia fell madly, deeply in love with him. A year and a half after they met, Arthur proposed. They were walking along the rugged, windswept cliffs of Cornwall. The sky was a dramatic shade of bruised purple, and the ocean was roaring below them. He didn't hire a photographer. He didn't orchestrate a flash mob or a massive public spectacle like her brother-in-law Brett had done for Victoria. Arthur simply stopped walking, pulled Julia gently toward him, and looked at her with an intensity that took her breath away. "Julia, my life is complicated," he said softly, holding both her hands. "There are things about my family responsibilities that I will eventually have to take on. It's not always an easy life, but there is no one else in this world I want by my side for it. I love you completely and entirely." He reached into the pocket of his battered jacket and pulled out a small, worn velvet box. Inside was a ring unlike anything she had ever seen. It wasn't a modern, flashy diamond. It was a massive, deep blue oval sapphire surrounded by a halo of old mine-cut diamonds set in tarnished, heavy gold. It looked ancient. It looked magical. "It belonged to my grandmother," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. "Will you marry me?" She said yes before he could even finish the question. For 3 weeks they lived in a blissfully isolated bubble of happiness. But eventually, reality came crashing in. Julia had to tell her family. She had to bring Arthur to America to meet the Harringtons. She warned him repeatedly about how awful they could be. They care about money, Arthur, and status. They're going to be terribly rude to you, she warned him as they packed for their flight to New York. Arthur just kissed her forehead, unbothered. Darling, I've dealt with stiff-necked snobs my entire life. I promise you, your father doesn't scare me. He had no idea what he was walking into. Her father insisted on hosting an intimate engagement dinner for them at the Harrington estate in Greenwich. By intimate, he meant a catered affair with 30 of his closest business associates, her mother's socialite friends, and of course Victoria and Brett. It was a calculated move. He wanted to parade Arthur around, assess his worth, and publicly establish dominance. When Arthur and Julia arrived, the stark contrast between them and the rest of the room was painfully obvious. Victoria was wearing a skin-tight, glittering Oscar de la Renta gown, dripping in Cartier jewelry. Brett stood next to her in a flashy Tom Ford tuxedo, loudly discussing his latest cryptocurrency investments with a group of older men. Julia wore a simple vintage silk slip dress she had bought in a boutique in Soho. Arthur, true to form, wore a beautifully tailored but completely unbranded navy suit. To the untrained new money eye of her family, it looked boring. What they didn't realize was that it was bespoke Savile Row, stitched perfectly to his frame, a suit that likely cost more than Brett's flashy designer tux. But her family only respected wealth that screamed. Arthur's wealth, or what Julia thought was just his modest savings, whispered. The moment they walked in the room, went quiet. Her father, holding a crystal glass of bourbon, looked Arthur up and down like he was inspecting a piece of rotting meat. So, the bookkeeper. Frederick boomed, not bothering to offer a handshake. Actually, sir, I manage my family's estate, Arthur replied smoothly, extending his hand anyway. Frederick reluctantly took it, offering a limp, dismissive shake. Dinner was a nightmare. Diane had deliberately placed Arthur at the center of the massive dining table, flanked by Frederick and Brett, turning the meal into a high-stakes interrogation. So, Artie, Brett said loudly, chewing on a piece of Wagyu beef. Julia says you're in agriculture. What kind of yield are we talking about? You guys doing soy corn. What's your portfolio look like? We don't farm it commercially in that sense, Arthur replied politely, taking a sip of his wine. It's mostly conservation land, tenant farming, and maintaining historical properties on the grounds. Frederick let out a harsh, barking laugh. Ah, so you're a glorified park ranger. Tell me, Arthur, how exactly do you plan to provide for my daughter on a groundskeeper's salary? Julia is used to a certain standard of living. Though looking at her dress tonight, I suppose she's forgotten what that looks like. Julia felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. Dad, stop it, she hissed. No, let the man speak. Victoria chimed in, swirling her champagne. She leaned across the table, eyeing Arthur with predatory amusement. I mean, it's just so quaint. You living in your little cottage reading your dusty books. But Julia, honestly, what are you going to do when you want to send your kids to private school? Is Arthur going to pay the tuition with antique poetry? The entire table chuckled. Julia's hand shook under the table. She wanted to grab Arthur, run out the front door, and never look back. But she felt Arthur's warm, steady hand cover hers under the table. He gave her fingers a reassuring squeeze. Arthur looked at Victoria, his face a mask of perfectly polite, icy composure. I believe the local schools near my family's home will be more than sufficient, Victoria. Education is highly valued where I come from. Right, Frederick sneered, dropping his napkin onto his plate. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, fixing Arthur with a venomous glare. Let's cut the crap. You're a nobody, Arthur. You have no money, no title, no standing. You think you can walk into my house and take my daughter without bringing anything to the table? Dad, Julia shouted, standing up her chair, scraping violently against the marble floor. That is enough. We are leaving. Ha! Sit down, Julia, her father roared back, his face turning red. You want to marry this peasant? Fine. Throw your life away. But hear me now, I will not pay a single cent for this wedding. I will not have my name attached to some cheap backyard barbecue of a reception. If you marry him, you pay for it yourselves. And don't expect a dime of inheritance either." The room was dead silent. Julia stood there, tears of anger and profound humiliation stinging her eyes. She looked at Arthur, terrified that this was the moment he would break, the moment he would realize her family's toxicity was too much to bear. Instead, Arthur stood up slowly. He didn't look angry. He looked completely and utterly bored. He buttoned his suit jacket, turned to her father, and spoke in a voice that was quiet, yet carried an unyielding, terrifying authority. "Mr. Harrington, I assure you Julia will not need your money. Not for this wedding, and certainly not for the rest of her life." Arthur's gaze flicked to Diane and Victoria. "As for the wedding, my family will be hosting it in our local chapel. We will, of course, send an invitation. Whether you choose to attend is entirely up to you." He stepped out from behind the table, offered Julia his arm, and gently guided her out of the dining room. As they walked toward the front door, she heard Brett scoff loudly behind them. "Local chapel," Brett laughed. "Probably got a tin roof and a dirt floor. Have fun being poor Julia." They walked out into the cool Connecticut night, the heavy front doors slamming behind them. Julia broke down in tears the moment they reached their rental car. She apologized profusely, burying her face in Arthur's chest, sobbing over her father's cruelty, over the embarrassment, over the sheer ugliness of it all. Arthur just held her tight, stroking her hair, kissing the top of her head. "Shh, my darling, it's all right," he murmured, his voice rumbling against her ear. "Let them talk. Let them think what they want. In a few months, they are going to have a very, very rude awakening." Julia didn't understand what he meant at the time. She was just grateful he hadn't left her. She wiped her tears, assuming he meant they would have a beautiful, modest wedding that would prove they didn't need their millions to be happy. She assumed our local chapel meant a quaint, ivy-covered stone church in a sleepy English village. She didn't know that Arthur's local chapel was St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, and she certainly didn't know that his grandmother, the original owner of her sapphire ring, was the Queen. The flight back to London was wrapped in a heavy, suffocating silence. Julia was exhausted, emotionally drained from the confrontation with her father, and deeply ashamed of her family's behavior. Arthur, however, was a fortress of calm. He read a paperback novel, his hand resting comfortably on her knee, completely unbothered by the venom her father had spat at him. It wasn't until they landed at Heathrow that Julia noticed the first shift in their reality. Usually they would queue up for the standard passport control, grab their bags, and hop onto the tube. This time, as they stepped off the plane, two men in impeccably tailored dark suits and discreet earpieces were waiting for them at the gate. "Sir," one of them said, giving a sharp, subtle nod to Arthur. "The car is ready." Julia blinked, sleep-deprived and confused. "Arthur, what's going on? Who are these men?" Arthur gently took her hand, his hazel eyes completely serious. "Julia, darling, we need to have a very long, very overdue conversation, and we need to have it in private." Instead of the crowded terminals, they were whisked down a private staircase and out onto the tarmac, where a sleek, armored Range Rover was waiting, its engine purring. Julia climbed into the back seat, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her mind raced with terrifying possibilities. Was he in the mafia? Was he an intelligence officer? Was a state management code for something highly illegal? As the tinted windows rolled up and the car glided seamlessly out of the airport, Arthur turned to her. He looked terrified, the first time she had ever seen him lose his cool. "Julia," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "I have never lied to you about who I am. I am Arthur. I love books, I love old estates, and I love you more than life itself. But I have omitted a rather significant part of my background." "Arthur, you're scaring me," she said, her voice trembling. "Just tell me." He took a deep breath, looking down at his hands before meeting her eyes. "My full name is Arthur Albert Christian George Mountbatten Windsor. My grandmother was Queen Elizabeth. My uncle is the king." The words hung in the air, heavy and incomprehensible. Julia stared at him. She waited for the punchline. She waited for that lopsided, charming smile to appear, and for him to tell her it was a brilliant joke meant to cheer her up after the disaster with her parents. But he didn't smile. He just looked at her with an agonizing vulnerability. You're a prince. The words felt utterly ridiculous leaving her mouth. Technically, yes. He winced slightly, as if the title itself was an uncomfortable jacket he was forced to wear. Though I am quite far down the line of succession. I've always tried to live as normally as possible. I don't undertake official royal duties, which is why I've managed to stay mostly out of the tabloids. My family estate in the north is Balmoral. The paperwork is managing the duchy lands. I wasn't lying, Julia. I was just protecting my peace. Protecting our peace. Julia looked down at her left hand, the heavy ancient sapphire ring. Your grandmother, she choked out. Yes, he said softly. It was one of her personal favorites. She left it to me before she passed, telling me to give it to a woman who possessed a quiet strength. A woman who wouldn't be blinded by the crown. For a full 10 minutes, Julia couldn't speak. She looked out the window at the gray London sky, her mind short-circuiting. The man she had eaten cheap fish and chips with, the man whose battered Land Rover constantly broke down, the man her father had just humiliated and called a nobody, was a British royal. Anger flared briefly. How could he hide this from her? But as she looked at him, seeing the genuine fear in his eyes, the fear that she might walk away, the anger melted into a profound, terrifying awe. She realized why he had remained so unbothered by her father's taunts. Her father's wealth was a drop in the ocean compared to the 1,000-year-old institution Arthur belonged to. Her father bragged about a Connecticut mansion. Arthur's family owned castles. Why didn't you tell me? She finally asked, her voice cracking. Because you loved me for me, Arthur said, pulling her into his arms. From the moment you yelled at me in that bookstore for questioning your expertise, you saw Arthur the book nerd. You didn't see the title. You didn't see the institution. If you had known, things would have been different. I wanted you to fall in love with a man, Julia, not a prince. And I am so incredibly sorry for ambushing you like this. But after the way your father treated us, the press will find out about the engagement soon. The palace machinery is about to wake up. I couldn't let you face it blindly. Julia rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady, aristocratic heartbeat that belonged entirely to her. She had run away from America to escape a family obsessed with status and power, only to accidentally fall in love with one of the most powerful men in the world. The irony was so sharp she almost laughed out loud. Okay, she whispered. Okay, what happens now? Now, Arthur smiled, a dangerous, brilliant glint in his eye. We plan a wedding, and we let your family dig their own grave. The transition from anonymous museum worker to future royal bride was both terrifying and utterly surreal. Within 24 hours of their conversation in the Range Rover, Julia's life was entirely swallowed by the palace machinery. They had to move out of her cramped Kensington flat and into a highly secure private wing at Kensington Palace. Her daily life became a whirlwind of briefings, non-disclosure agreements, and meetings with private secretaries. Yet through it all, Arthur's family was shockingly warm. Far from the icy, calculating royals the media often portrayed, they welcomed her with open arms. When Julia finally met the king, she was practically trembling, but he simply offered a warm smile, kissed her cheeks, and told Arthur, "Well done, my boy. She has far too much sense for you." They were a family bound by duty, yes, but they possessed a quiet, dignified respect for one another, the exact opposite of the Harringtons. The strategy regarding her family was orchestrated with military precision. Arthur and Julia decided not to explicitly tell them about his royal status. They had made their assumptions, and the couple was going to let them run with them. If we tell them the truth now," Arthur pointed out one evening as they reviewed the guest list in their sitting room, "they will suddenly become the most doting, supportive parents in the world. They will plaster your face all over Greenwich. They will brag, they will leak to the press, and they will try to turn our wedding into a networking event for your father's business." He was absolutely right. The thought of her father bragging about his royal son-in-law at the country club made Julia's stomach turn. She wanted them at her wedding. They were her family for better or worse. But she wanted them there as the people they truly were, without the fake veneer of respect they would instantly adopt if they knew Arthur's title. So the palace sent out a highly specific, deceptively simple invitation. To the rest of the world and the royal guests, the invitations were magnificent, embossed with gold crests, and delivered by courier. But for the Harringtons, Arthur's private secretary drafted something different. It was elegant, yes, but devoid of the royal coat of arms. It simply read, "Mr. Arthur Mountbatten Windsor and Miss Julia Harrington request the honor of your presence at their marriage. St. George's Chapel, Windsor." When the invitation arrived in Connecticut, Diane called Julia immediately. Julia was sitting in a fitting room at Alexander McQueen, surrounded by yards of Duchess satin and antique lace, while a royal protection officer stood guard outside the door. "Julia, dear." Her mother sighed over the phone, the familiar tone of condescending exasperation loud and clear. "We received the invitation, if you can call it that. It's so terribly plain, darling. Not even a proper calligraphy script. It's a traditional British style, Mom," Julia said, catching the eye of the head seamstress in the mirror and suppressing a smile. "Well, your father is furious, of course," she went on. "Mountbatten Windsor. Honestly, Julia, the pretension of this boy to use a double-barreled name when he clearly hasn't got a pot to piss in. And Windsor. Really, could you not find a venue in London? Your father had his assistant look it up. There are dozens of cheap little chapels in the town of Windsor. It's practically a tourist trap." Julia had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep from laughing. Her father's assistant had probably Googled St. George's Chapel, Windsor, and lacking any basic knowledge of British royal landmarks, assumed it was just a local parish church near the castle. They had no idea it was the final resting place of monarchs, the private chapel of the royal family, and a venue strictly forbidden to anyone without royal blood. "It's a very special chapel to Arthur's family, Mom," Julia said smoothly. "I'm sure it is," Diane scoffed. "Well, your father has agreed to attend mostly to save face. We can't have people thinking we've completely abandoned our daughter, even if you are making a catastrophic mistake. We've booked suites at the Savoy. We'll fly in on Thursday. I suppose we'll see you at the rehearsal dinner. Where is it, some local pub?" "Actually, yes," Julia replied. "Arthur's family is hosting it at a private club." "A private club. How quaint," she muttered. "Listen, Julia, Victoria is throwing an absolute fit about having to wear off the rack for this. Please tell me there isn't a hideous bridesmaid dress." "No bridesmaids, Mom. Just keep it simple." "Simple. Story of your life, Julia. We'll see you Thursday." She hung up. Julia handed the phone to her lady-in-waiting, a lovely woman named Beatrice, who raised a single elegant eyebrow. "Family?" Beatrice asked. "Yes." Julia smiled, stepping up onto the pedestal as the seamstress pinned the breathtaking train of her bespoke gown. "They think Arthur has rented a tourist-trap chapel and booked a local pub." Beatrice let out a soft, delighted laugh. "Oh, ma'am, they are going to need oxygen." The secret was kept airtight. The British press, typically rabid for royal news, was operating under a strict embargo enforced by the palace. Arthur, being a non-working royal, was granted the privilege of privacy until the actual week of the wedding. It wasn't until the Monday before the ceremony that the palace released the official announcement to the BBC and global news outlets. But Julia's family, insulated in their own bubble of American corporate news hedge fund reports and country club gossip, completely missed it. They didn't watch the BBC. They didn't read the British tabloids. They lived in an echo chamber of their own making. The trap was perfectly set. The Harrington family descended upon London like a dark, judgmental cloud 3 days before the wedding. True to their word, Frederick had spared no expense on their own comfort, booking the most lavish penthouse suites at the Savoy overlooking the River Thames. Arthur and Julia, surrounded by an invisible, heavily armed security detail, went to meet them for afternoon tea at the hotel on Thursday. Julia was wearing a tailored Catherine Walker coat and a simple but undeniably expensive silk dress. Arthur was in a crisp, dark suit. They looked entirely different from the bohemian librarian and the penniless bookkeeper. The Harringtons remembered from the engagement dinner, but their prejudice was so blinding they didn't even notice. When they walked into the private tea room, Victoria was loudly complaining to a waiter about the temperature of the scones. Brett was aggressively typing on his phone, and Frederick was nursing a scotch, looking at his watch with deep irritation. Finally, Frederick grunted as they approached the table. He didn't stand up. Traffic in this godforsaken city is a nightmare. What the hell's going on out there? There are Union Jack flags strung up across every street from here to Mayfair. Are they having a parade for the mayor or something? Arthur and Julia exchanged a fleeting, brilliant look. Something like that, Arthur said politely, pulling out a chair for Julia. Well, it's a massive inconvenience. Brett chimed in, tossing his phone onto the table. My driver said the M4 is going to be partially closed on Saturday. Some VIP movement. Total joke. Hey Artie, hope your little chapel in Windsor isn't too hard to get to, because if we get stuck in traffic for your backyard bash, I'm turning the car around. We have made specific travel arrangements for you, Brett. Arthur replied, his tone perfectly, even though Julia could see the amusement dancing in his hazel eyes. Cars will be provided by my family on Saturday morning to ensure you bypass any public road closures. Hired cars? Victoria sneered, dragging her eyes over Julia's outfit. Well, I hope they aren't those dreadful little minivans. I'm wearing a vintage Givenchy, Julia. I cannot be crammed into a cab. And honestly, your dress today? Did you find a new thrift store in London? Julia looked at her sister, feeling a profound wave of pity for her. She was so desperate to project superiority that she couldn't recognize a custom-tailored piece of haute couture if it slapped her in the face. It's comfortable, Julia said mildly. Comfortable. Diane echoed, sipping her tea with a dramatic shudder. Frederick, do you hear this? We are flying across the Atlantic, spending a fortune at the Savoy, all for a comfortable wedding. Julia, I demand to know who is doing the catering. I have an incredibly sensitive stomach, and if Arthur's family is serving rustic farm-to-table slop, I will absolutely starve. The catering is being handled by the venue's internal staff, Mrs. Harrington. Arthur intervened smoothly. I assure you the head chef is quite accustomed to dealing with sensitive palates. Internal staff, Frederick scoffed, draining his scotch. So church volunteers, fantastic. Just what I always dreamed of for my daughter, a potluck wedding. He slammed his glass down on the table, fixing Arthur with that same venomous predatory glare he had used in Connecticut. Let's get one thing straight, Arthur. I'm only here because the press in New York expects a Harrington to show up. I'm doing this for optics. I don't approve of you, I don't approve of this wedding, and the moment the ceremony is over, we are coming back to London. I will not be sticking around for whatever pathetic barn dance you have planned for a reception. The air in the room grew icy. A man sitting at the table next to them, who Julia knew was a plainclothes royal protection officer, shifted slightly in his seat, his hand subtly moving toward his jacket. Julia gave the officer a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head. Stand down. Arthur didn't flinch. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, exuding an aura of absolute power that made Frederick subconsciously lean back. Mr. Harrington. Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, losing all traces of his previous polite deference. You are guests in my country. You are guests of my family. I strongly suggest you temper your expectations and reserve your judgment until Saturday. You will attend the ceremony, you will attend the reception, and you will treat my future wife with the respect she deserves, or I promise you the optics back in New York will be the least of your concerns. Frederick's face flushed a deep, angry purple. He opened his mouth to shout, but something in Arthur's eyes, a fierce, untamed, ancient kind of authority, made him snap his jaw shut. Victoria giggled nervously, trying to break the tension. Ooh, big words from the estate manager. What are you going to do, Arthur ban us from the local library? Arthur stood up, buttoning his jacket. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely victorious. I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow evening for the rehearsal, Arthur said pleasantly. A car will collect you at 6. Do try to be on time. He offered Julia his hand, and they walked out of the tea room, leaving her utterly bewildered, infuriated family behind. That, Arthur whispered in her ear as they stepped into the waiting elevator, the door sliding shut to block out the view of her red-faced father, was incredibly satisfying. The next evening, Friday, was the rehearsal dinner. True to his word, Arthur had arranged for a fleet of black unmarked, heavily armored Range Rovers to pick up Julia's family at the Savoy. When they arrived at the location, one could see the confusion radiating from them. Instead of a local pub, the cars pulled up to the imposing wrought iron gates of a highly exclusive, centuries-old private gentlemen's club in St. James's, a club where prime ministers and royalty dined behind closed doors. The exterior was unpretentious, marked only by a brass plaque, which immediately led Frederick to complain loudly as he stepped out of the car. "Looks like a morgue," Brett loudly observed to the liveried doorman, who looked at him with an expression of polite disgust. Julia was waiting for them in the grand foyer, wearing a stunning red Valentino evening gown. As they walked in, their complaints died in their throats. The interior of the club was breathtaking, towering marble columns, priceless oil paintings of British monarchs, and glittering crystal chandeliers. "Julia," her mother whispered, her eyes wide as she took in the opulent surroundings. What is this place? I thought you said we were going to a pub. Arthur's family has a membership here." Julia replied smoothly, ignoring the fact that Arthur's grandfather had literally been the patron of the club. They thought it would be nice to have a quiet dinner before the chaos of tomorrow. Membership. Her father repeated, his brow furrowing as he looked at a massive painting of King George V. How the hell does a park ranger afford a membership here? Before she could answer, the double oak doors leading to the private dining room swung open. Arthur emerged, dressed in a flawless midnight blue velvet dinner jacket. Behind him, the room was filled with about 40 people. There were no flashing cameras, no press, just Arthur's family. But it wasn't just any family. Diane's jaw slowly dropped. She was a socialite. She spent her life studying the faces of the global elite in magazines. As she peered past Arthur into the dining room, she saw a woman who looked strikingly like the Princess of Wales, chatting amiably with a man who bore an uncanny resemblance to the King of England. "Julia," her mother choked out, gripping Julia's arm with nails that dug into her skin. "Julia, who are these people?" "Oh, just Arthur's relatives." Julia smiled sweetly, gently, prying her mother's fingers off her arm. "Come on in, Mom. It's time to meet the in-laws." Diane's face drained of color so rapidly it looked as though she might actually collapse onto the immaculate centuries-old Persian rug beneath their feet. She stood paralyzed at the threshold of the private dining room, her eyes darting frantically. She looked from the unmistakable world-famous profile of the British monarch to the glittering, elegant crowd that was currently sipping vintage champagne and chatting in low, refined voices. The air in the St. James's Club smelled faintly of expensive beeswax antique polished wood and the kind of quiet generational wealth that makes Wall Street billionaires look like absolute peasants. "Julia," Frederick hissed, stepping up beside Diane. His hands were suddenly trembling, and his voice was tight with a mixture of profound confusion and mounting panic. "What kind of elaborate prank is this? Are those lookalikes? Did Brett hire actors from some agency?" "I assure you, Mr. Harrington, they are quite real," Arthur said. The shift in Arthur was instantaneous and breathtaking. His voice was smooth as glass, completely stripped of the deferential, polite tone he had forced himself to use during that disastrous engagement dinner in Connecticut. He stood slightly taller now, his shoulders squared effortlessly, commanding the gravity of the room. He was no longer the humble book dealer or the quiet estate manager. He was a Mountbatten Windsor, standing squarely in the center of his ancestral domain. He placed a gentle, reassuring hand on the small of Julia's back and guided her forward into the lion's den. Come, let me properly introduce you to my family. They walked into the room, Julia's parents, sister, and brother-in-law trailing behind them, like terrified sheep being led to slaughter. The low hum of aristocratic conversation naturally paused as Arthur subtly clinked a silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute. The room turned toward them in elegant unison. Family friends. Arthur began, his voice carrying easily over the vast, opulent space, echoing slightly off the gilded ceiling. May I present the Harringtons, Julia's parents, Frederick and Diane, her sister Victoria, and her husband Brett. The sea of titled nobility gracefully parted. Walking toward them, holding a glass of sparkling water and sporting an incredibly warm grandfatherly smile, was the King of England. Beside him was the Queen Consort, wearing a stunningly elegant emerald green evening dress that made Diane's designer gown look entirely garish by comparison. Diane let out a small, strangled squeak, slapping a hand over her mouth. Brett, who had spent the last 2 years loudly bragging about his proximity to Silicon Valley billionaires and hedge fund managers, suddenly looked very small. His mouth hung open in slack-jawed horror as he stared at the literal head of state. "Ah, the Americans have arrived," the king proclaimed warmly, stepping forward and extending a hand to Frederick. Frederick, a man who prided himself on intimidating boardrooms full of ruthless real estate executives, physically shrank. He completely forgot to bow. He forgot how to speak. His usually aggressive posture dissolved into a mess of nervous twitches as he took the monarch's hand. Your Majesty." Frederick finally choked out. His voice cracked like a pubescent teenager's, entirely devoid of its usual booming authority. Welcome to London, Frederick," the king said cheerfully. Though his smile was polite, his sharp, intelligent eyes held a dangerous glint of steel. "Arthur has told us so much about you, and of course about your passionate defense of your daughter's future. It is a terrifying thing giving one's daughter away, is it not? One always worries if the young man is quite up to the task of providing the proper lifestyle." The subtle, polite evisceration was uniquely perfectly British. The king wasn't shouting. He wasn't overtly aggressive. But with 2 simple sentences, he let Frederick know that he was entirely aware of the brutal, humiliating interrogation Arthur had endured at the dining table in Greenwich. Yes, Your Majesty," Frederick stammered, beads of cold sweat forming on his forehead. "I only wanted what was best for Julia. We weren't aware, as do we all want what is best." The king smiled, patting Frederick's shoulder with a heavy final hand. "Fortunately, Arthur manages to scrape by. We do try to keep the family estates from falling into total disrepair. Come, Diane, let me introduce you to Catherine. She has been positively dying to hear all about your American wedding traditions." The king smoothly escorted a petrified Diane away, leaving Frederick standing alone, visibly shaking. Julia turned her attention to her sister. Victoria, the beautiful, ruthlessly ambitious golden child who had mocked Julia's thrift store dresses and laughed at her penniless fiancé, was staring at her with a look of pure, unadulterated shock. Her vintage Givenchy gown suddenly looked like it was trying far too hard amidst the effortless, centuries-old elegance of the room. She looked at Arthur, then at Julia, the terrifying reality slowly washing over her features. "A prince!" Victoria whispered, her voice barely audible over the clinking of crystal. "You are marrying a royal prince." "He's an estate manager, Victoria." Julia corrected her gently, offering the sweetest, most poisonous smile she could muster. "He just manages a very, very large estate." The rest of the evening was a masterclass in psychological torture for the Harrington family. They were trapped in a room with some of the most powerful and recognizable people on the planet, yet they were entirely unable to boast leverage or network. Every time Brett attempted to pivot a conversation toward his tech investments, he was politely met with blank, uncomprehending stares by dukes and earls who couldn't care less about his cryptocurrency portfolio. Every time Frederick tried to assert his usual dominance, He was outflanked by the sheer weight of 1,000 years of history and protocol. They were nobodies. For the first time in their incredibly privileged lives, the Harringtons were the poorest, least influential people in the room, and watching them squirm was glorious. Before the night ended, Arthur's uncle the king raised his glass to the room to call for a toast. To Julia, the king proclaimed, looking directly at her with genuine fatherly affection. A young woman who saw past the heavy titles we hide behind and loved my nephew for the man he truly is. She has brought a breath of fresh air and profound integrity into this dusty old institution. We are incredibly blessed to welcome her into our family, and to the Harringtons, thank you for giving us such a remarkable treasure. Frederick raised his glass, but his eyes were entirely hollow. He looked at Julia across the room, and for the first time in her entire life, she didn't see disappointment or anger in his gaze. She saw total defeat. The realization had finally hit him. He couldn't buy this. He couldn't control this. Julia had ascended to a realm of society he could never ever touch. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear, the typically gray English skies breaking to reveal a brilliant, crisp blue. The town of Windsor was practically vibrating with energy. Frederick had threatened Julia with the prospect of an embarrassing cheap wedding. He had sworn he wouldn't pay a single cent, hoping the financial strain would force her to crawl back to him and beg for his approval. Instead, Julia awoke in a sprawling suite at Windsor Castle surrounded by royal dressmakers, hairstylists, and her lady-in-waiting Beatrice. Through the massive stone mullioned windows, she could hear the distant rhythmic drumming of military bands and the roar of a crowd that numbered in the tens of thousands. The Union Jack flags that her father had complained about at the Savoy were out in full force, draped across every available surface in town. The entire world had tuned in. The press embargo had lifted on Monday, and the global media had exploded with the news the quiet, fiercely private Prince Arthur was marrying an unknown American antiquities expert. At 10 a.m., Diane and Frederick were escorted into a highly secure gleaming Rolls-Royce Phantom from the royal fleet. Later, Beatrice would tell Julia the details of their journey. As their car made its way up the long walk toward the castle gates, flanked by mounted cavalry in glittering breastplates and plumed helmets, her parents were met with a sea of screaming crowds, waving flags and holding up signs. News helicopters hovered overhead. The scale of the event was so massive, so profoundly historic, that Frederick sat in the back seat in absolute stunned silence. Brett and Victoria were escorted separately. Victoria, who had spent millions trying to ensure her own wedding was the social event of the decade, had to walk past the flashing bulbs of hundreds of international press photographers completely ignored. Nobody cared what she was wearing. Nobody cared who Brett was. They were ushered into the nave of St. George's Chapel, a breathtaking Gothic masterpiece of vaulted stone ceilings and stained glass, and seated in the section reserved for the bride's non-royal family. They sat on historic wooden benches surrounded by foreign dignitaries, heads of state and Hollywood royalty, shrinking into the background of Julia's magnificent reality. At exactly 11:45 a.m., Julia's carriage arrived at the west steps of the chapel. She stepped out, and a collective gasp rippled through the gathered crowds outside the gates. She wore a bespoke gown of heavy ivory silk radzimere, with a sweeping dramatic train embroidered with the national flowers of the United Kingdom and the state flower of Connecticut, a subtle nod to her roots despite the pain her family had caused her. But it was the piece resting on her head that commanded the most attention. Arthur's family had graciously allowed Julia access to the royal vaults, and she wore the Queen Mary fringed tiara, a towering, brilliant piece of history crafted from diamonds that caught the morning sun and threw rainbows across the ancient stone steps. Frederick was waiting for her just inside the Galilee porch. Palace protocol dictated that the father of the bride could walk her halfway down the aisle, meeting the groom at the choir. When Frederick saw her, his breath hitched. He looked at the tiara, the diamonds, the impossibly grand setting, and then he looked into her eyes. "Julia," he whispered, his voice trembling violently. I had no idea. My God, Julia, I am so sorry. It was the first time in 26 years she had ever heard Frederick Harrington apologize. But it wasn't an apology born of genuine regret for how he had treated her. It was an apology born of fear. He was apologizing to the crown, to the wealth, to the sheer terrifying power of the institution she was marrying into. "It's fine, Dad," Julia said quietly, her voice devoid of emotion. "Just don't step on my train. Let's not embarrass the family." She threw his own words back at him, perfectly calm. He flinched as if she had physically struck him. The heavy oak doors opened, and the soaring, angelic voices of the St. George's Chapel choir echoed through the nave, singing an ancient anthem. Frederick offered his arm. He was shaking. Julia placed her hand lightly on his sleeve, entirely steady. They walked down the aisle past her weeping mother, past a green with envy Victoria, past rows of the most influential people on earth. But Julia barely saw them. Her eyes were locked on the altar. Standing there dressed in the immaculate gold-braided dark blue uniform of the Blues and Royals, complete with military honors, and a gleaming sword at his hip, was Arthur. He wasn't the penniless bookkeeper. He wasn't the glorified groundskeeper. He was her prince. When they reached the center of the chapel, Frederick stepped back, bowing deeply, not to Arthur, but to the altar and the king sitting in the front row. He retreated to his seat, a broken, humbled man. Arthur took Julia's hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. He gave her that familiar, lopsided, devastatingly charming smile. "You look all right," he whispered cheekily, echoing a joke they had made on their second date. "You don't look too bad yourself for a park ranger," she whispered back. The Archbishop of Canterbury stepped forward, and in front of God, her family, and a global television audience of millions, they were married. The reception was held at the breathtaking state apartments within Windsor Castle. It was a fairy tale brought to life, towering floral arrangements of white English roses, champagne flowing from crystal fountains, and a string quartet playing softly in the corner of St. George's Hall. For Julia's family, however, the reception was an exercise in absolute isolation. Frederick, ever the opportunist, had quickly recovered from his initial shock and decided that this was the greatest networking opportunity of his life. After all, he was now officially the father-in-law of a British prince. He grabbed a glass of vintage Pole Roger and began prowling the room looking for investors, politicians, or anyone he could leverage. He didn't get far. The palace is a beautifully orchestrated machine, and Arthur had given very specific instructions to his protection officers and the royal equerries. Every time Frederick approached a high-ranking official or a member of the royal family, a fiercely polite, flawlessly dressed aide would intercept him. "Mr. Harrington Saruman," an equerry would say, smoothly stepping seamlessly between Frederick and the Prime Minister. "So wonderful to see you enjoying the champagne. If you'll excuse us, the Prime Minister is required for a photograph." This happened repeatedly. Frederick was walled off, boxed out, and completely neutralized by the invisible, impenetrable barrier of royal protocol. He was allowed to look, but he was strictly forbidden to touch. Meanwhile, Victoria had found a quiet corner near a massive portrait of Queen Victoria and was aggressively whispering at Brett. "You told me he was a loser." Julia overheard her hissing as she walked past with Arthur, pretending not to notice them. "You told me he worked on a farm. My sister's wearing a tiara worth more than your entire company." "Brett, how did you not know?" How was I supposed to know?" Brett shot back, his face red and sweaty. "He drove a 10-year-old car. Who the hell hides being royalty?" Later in the evening, after a magnificent 5-course dinner served on gold-rimmed china that belonged to King George III, it was time for the speeches. Traditionally, the father of the bride gives a speech. Frederick had fully anticipated this, standing up and buttoning his tuxedo jacket, clearly preparing to deliver a grand, sweeping monologue, taking credit for Julia's success and welcoming Arthur into the Harrington Empire. But as he moved toward the microphone set up at the head of the massive banqueting table, a tall, imposing royal protection officer simply stepped into his path, shaking his head once. Only the groom and his majesty will be speaking tonight, sir, the officer murmured. Please return to your seat. Frederick stood frozen, his face burning with humiliation, as the entire room watched him slowly sink back into his chair. He had been silenced. His money meant nothing there. His ego had been entirely dismantled. Arthur stood up to raucous applause. He looked across the room, his eyes sweeping over the crowd before landing softly on Julia. They say that a man is only as good as the company he keeps. Arthur began, his voice warm and steady. For most of my life, I have been surrounded by history, by duty, by titles. It is a profound privilege, but it can also be a heavy shield. We use it to keep the world at arm's length. He paused, looking directly at the table where Julia's parents sat. When I met Julia, she didn't know about the shield. She didn't know about the titles. And when she found out I lived a quiet, modest life, a life that many in her world deemed insignificant, she didn't run. She stood by me. She defended me. She proved that true wealth is not measured in bank accounts or corporate takeovers or the zip code you reside in. True wealth is finding someone who loves your soul stripped bare of all worldly trappings. The room erupted in applause. Julia saw the king wipe a discreet tear from his eye. She saw her mother look down at her lap, her face flushed with shame. To my beautiful wife, Arthur concluded, raising his glass, who never needed a crown to be a queen. The night ended with a spectacular fireworks display over the castle grounds. As Arthur and Julia prepared to leave the reception in a vintage Aston Martin DB6, she stopped by the grand staircase to say goodbye to her family. They stood huddled together, looking exhausted, overwhelmed, and incredibly small. "Goodbye, Dad," Julia said, offering a polite, distant smile. "Thank you for coming. I know it wasn't the high society event you wanted." Frederick looked at her, his eyes searching her face for any trace of the terrified, obedient daughter he used to bully at the mahogany dining table in Connecticut. He found nothing. She was untouchable. "Julia," he started, his voice thick. We should talk. When you get back from the honeymoon, I'd love to have you and Arthur over. We could discuss some mutual interests." Even now, he was trying to figure out an angle. Julia felt a brief pang of sadness for him, quickly replaced by a profound sense of peace. "We'll be quite busy, Dad," Julia replied softly. "Estate management requires a lot of paperwork, you know. Safe flight back to America." She turned her back on the Harringtons, walking out into the cool, crisp English night. Arthur was waiting by the car, holding the door open for her. As she slid into the leather seat, the crowd gathered outside the castle gates let out a massive, echoing cheer. Frederick had told her not to embarrass the family. He had warned her not to throw her life away. As Arthur shifted the Aston Martin into gear, and they drove away into their new, brilliantly illuminated future, leaving Frederick standing in the shadows of her castle, Julia realized she hadn't just avoided embarrassing the family. She had transcended them entirely. Did you love this story of ultimate royal payback? Julia proved that true class cannot be bought, and watching her toxic, status-obsessed family realize they were entirely out of their league was deeply satisfying. If you want more dramatic, real-life inspired storytelling, filled with shocking twists, emotional justice, and unforgettable moments, make sure to hit that like button. Share this video with a friend who loves a good high society takedown. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you never miss out on our next thrilling story. See you in the next one.